From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors around the world. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and educator living and working in the beautiful city of Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead. And I don't feel so well myself. Now, if you listened to the first Daniel Chester French episode, you know that Dan French had a long and successful career in producing memorials of many types. The public memorial statues that he created of the great men genre, for instance, like the monument to John Harvard or the Abraham Lincoln statue in Nebraska. French also made many allegorical groups and figures to decorate the facades of various federal and state governmental buildings, post offices, customs houses, and the like. But also he made many memorials for private clients, many in the form of funerary monuments like the Millmore Memorial or the Melvin Memorial. And had this been the entirety of his career, Daniel Chester French still would have been remembered as one of the best American sculptors of the 19th century. But he is remembered today as more than that. He is often mentioned as one of only two truly great American sculptors from this time, alongside, of course, Augustus St. Gaudens. Now, talent and success will make you a talented and successful sculptor. But to be recognized as great, a sculptor must use their talent and success to create a work of art that is more than good. It needs also to be significant. Now, some sculptors, to paraphrase Shakespeare, are born great. Others have greatness thrust upon them, and we might include French in this latter group. As fate would have it, the most significant federal commission the United States has ever commissioned from a sculptor fell to Daniel Chester French. And today we're going to focus our attention on a single sculpture that he produced, namely the Lincoln Memorial. But we're also going to broaden the scope of the discussion to include other aspects of the Lincoln Memorial, the people and events connected to the construction of that memorial, and also what the Lincoln Memorial has come to represent in America's cultural landscape. Now, in 1896, Daniel Chester French was 46 years old and in the prime of his career. Works such as the Minuteman Monument and the Gallaudet Monument were products of his early career, and works like the Millmore Memorial and the Statue of the Republic for the Chicago World's Fair had made him famous. He had been married for 8 years by this time, and he had had a daughter. And after studying and working in Paris, Florence, New York, Washington, D.C., and Boston, Dan French and his family began to look for a place to call their own, at least in the summer months, away from the noise and heat and commotion of New York City. And they found it in the Berkshires of western Massachusetts. They purchased a 150-acre farm and renamed it Chesterwood. This was to become their summer home and eventually their full-time residence. And with the construction of a studio there in 1898, it would also become Daniel Chester French's primary sculpture studio. Now, if this sounds vaguely familiar, it's because Augustus St. Gaudens had done something very similar, purchasing a farm in the countryside of New England, building a studio there, summering there, and then eventually retiring there. And by now it's almost a running joke. There are so many aspects of Augustus St. Gaudens' career that seem to be repeated, if not imitated, in the career of Dan French. But if Augustus St. Gaudens built his countryside studio first, it has to be said that Daniel Chester French built his countryside studio best. French's home and studio, known as Chesterwood, is now run by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and is open to the public much of the year. I've personally never been, but it is definitely on my bucket list, not just to see firsthand the original plasters of Dan French's works, as well as the collection of tools he used in modeling and casting, but also because by all accounts, Chesterwood is the perfect sculpture studio. The design of the studio was a collaboration between French and his lifelong friend and professional collaborator, the architect Henry Bacon. Now, one enters the studio through a front door, which faces a paved area with a fountain that was designed by the architect, Henry Bacon, and French called this area his piazza. And from this piazza there are fantastic views of the mountain ranges and valleys of the area. From there you walk in through the front door, and you enter a cozy parlor where visitors were received, complete with a fireplace and a piano and shelves full of books and several comfortable chairs. Now, through doors to the right, one can exit into a garden or go straight ahead through other doors into the studio proper. Now, the main area of the studio has a 23-foot-high ceiling with north-facing skylights, of course, and a separate casting and mold-making room off to one side. Now, what makes this otherwise excellent studio really stand out are, first of all, large double doors, 22 feet tall, which open to the west onto a lawn. Now, the enormous doors flood the studio with natural light, and the question of light vis-a-vis sculpture was always a primary concern for French, as it should be for all sculptors whose work is destined to be placed out of doors. Now, it's one thing to create a clay model that looks good in your studio, but the subtleties of your modeling might be completely lost in the full sun. So these doors let in ample light, even on the cloudiest of summer days. But the doors are really only there to facilitate the studio's crowning glory, the 5-foot gauge railroad track laid into the floor of the studio and running straight out these doors and across the lawn for over 30 feet. So even his largest clay models, still in wet clay, could be moved out of doors and placed in full sun whenever he needed to analyze the effects of his modeling under outdoor conditions. The models didn't even need to be put onto the track itself. His large modeling turntable was built right onto the top of a railroad flat car, right? And the floor of the studio was built at the height of the bed of the flat car. So the bed of the flat car effectively becomes a section of the studio floor. And there's another removable section of flooring which covers the tracks when they're not in use. And so when the doors are closed and the floor is covered up, you would never know that there were tracks even there. Now, one great advantage of building the studio with a raised floor up to the height of this flat car is that when the sculpture is taken outside via the railroad tracks, it's now 4 or 5 feet off the ground, giving Daniel Chester French a more appropriate viewing angle for his monuments, which of course would eventually be placed on pedestals. Dan French's excellent studio is the result of the collaboration between a sculptor and an architect, and it would not be the last time that Dan French teamed up with Henry Bacon. After all, if you are an architect working in the Beaux-Arts idiom like Henry Bacon was, it goes without saying that you will be collaborating with sculptors, as sculptural adornment is basically what makes architecture Beaux-Arts architecture. And Daniel Chester French became the champion steed in Henry Bacon's stable. They had known each other for years through other large collaborative works, including a few different World's Fairs that they were both involved in. And Henry Bacon had learned architecture as a draftsman at the firm of McKim, Mead, and White, the leading Beaux-Arts architecture firm in the United States, with whom Auguste St. Gaudens had collaborated in his own career. In 1897, Bacon left McKim, Mead, and White to start his own firm with fellow architect James Bright, and the firm of Bacon and Bright was soon completing buildings and monuments in the Beaux-Arts style throughout the United States. They also designed several private residences, and French's studio at Chesterwood was one of the new firm's first projects. The two became good friends, and future collaborations would include the Melvin Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial in Nebraska, both of which I mentioned in the previous podcast. Now, what likely prompted Henry Bacon to start his own firm in 1897 was the instance of being asked to come up with a few designs for a national monument to Abraham Lincoln to be placed in Washington, D.C. He was approached by a governmental commission set up by Congress specifically to erect a national monument to Lincoln, but this commission was the latest in a long succession of committees ordered to do so. Congress, in fact, had been trying to get a national monument raised in Lincoln's honor since just after his assassination in 1865, but these various committees had been thwarted by finances and by unfavorable political climates. There was no guarantee that this latest commission would be any more successful in raising funding or appeasing various governmental factions, but nevertheless, Henry Bacon threw himself into the project, almost obsessively designing and redesigning monuments over the next several years. In fact, the amount of time that he was spending on this project, for which he was as yet not being paid, was a thorn in his partner's side, and it contributed to the split of Bacon and Bright in 1903. The Lincoln Memorial got a big boost in 1902, however, with Congress's adoption of the McMillan Plan. Now, if you listen to the World's Fair and City Beautiful episode of The Sculptor's Funeral, you will remember that the McMillan Plan was the master city planning project for Washington, D.C., designed to rid the nation's capital of urban slums and create a national town square. It was a plan for the placement of governmental buildings and monuments and green spaces, incorporating the pre-existing Capitol building and White House, and all connected by broad avenues and water features, and centered on a green park-like space, which we now know as the National Mall. The masterminds behind this master plan were none other than the firm of McKim, Mead & White, the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, and the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, one of the more prominent features of this McMillan Plan was the siting of a national monument to Abraham Lincoln, sited due west of the Capitol building. Now, the Capitol was one anchor point of the east-west axis of the entire design of the McMillan Plan, and the Lincoln Memorial would be the other anchor point, a siting which would make it as prominent as the Capitol building and the Washington Monument. So, with an eager and qualified architect, a government commission, and a master city plan all calling for a Lincoln Memorial, what could stand in the way of its construction? Well, meet Joe Cannon. Joseph Gurney Cannon was one of the most powerful politicians in American history who never ascended to the presidency, but he's little remembered today. But in his time, he was a force of nature. He was the de facto leader of the Republican Party and a member of the House of Representatives. At his retirement, he had the distinction of being the longest-serving Republican member of Congress in history, the first ever to surpass over 40 years in office. Cannon was also the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Congress from 1903 to 1911, the longest-serving Speaker in history at that time. All these endurance records have since been broken, but only relatively recently. Joe Cannon was also the very first person on the cover of Time magazine in 1923, chosen not just for his immense power he wielded, but also for his larger-than-life personality. He was a small, diminutive man, but with a ferocious and fearless demeanor, unafraid to stand up to even the likes of President Theodore Roosevelt. Of Roosevelt, in fact, Cannon once publicly said that, quote, "Roosevelt has no more use for the Constitution than a tomcat has for a marriage license." Now keep in mind that Roosevelt and Cannon were both members of the same political party. They were both Republicans. Joe Cannon was a favorite of the press, of course, as he always had an audacious opinion or a pithy comment to share, and he was known across America by the nickname Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe ran the House of Representatives more like a mafia boss or a dictator than like an elected public servant. He was able to do this because at the same time that he was Speaker of the House of Representatives, basically the leader of the House of Representatives, he was also the chairman of the Rules Committee, which meant that not only did he control which bills would come up for debate, but he also controlled which rules would apply to a bill's debate or amendment and other voting procedures. He also had the sole power to appoint heads of committees. He controlled what the House did, how they did it, stocking committees with sycophants and changing the rules to suit his own agenda. Within the House, his power was absolute. And Uncle Joe, Joe Gurney Cannon, a Republican representative from Abraham Lincoln's home state of Illinois and an admirer and devotee of Lincoln, was completely opposed to the Lincoln Memorial. Not because Joe Cannon was opposed to memorializing Lincoln, but because he thought that the memorial, placed on the site proposed by the McMillan Plan, would be a great disservice to Lincoln's memory. It seems nonsensical at first, but to understand his opposition, we need to imagine what the area looked like at the turn of the 20th century. Now, the land where the Lincoln Memorial now stands, as well as much of the surrounding area, was only recently recovered swampland at this point. The Army Corps of Engineers had drained the swampy area only a few decades before, but it was still just undeveloped, soggy, weedy, and at the time seemed a remote distance from the Capitol and the White House. And it was one thing to look at the map of the McMillan Plan on paper and imagine an entirely intact national mall filled with buildings and boulevards and green spaces. But it was quite another to trudge half a mile through waist-high grass and weeds to the proposed site and imagine the desolate and remote area as a fitting site to honor Lincoln. At the end of the day, it comes down to a lack of imagination on Joe Cannon's part. Now, if you want to more fully understand Uncle Joe Cannon's point of view, there is a photograph on the image gallery for this episode, which is episode number 71, which will give you an idea of his concerns. Now, in this photo, we can see the newly completed Lincoln Memorial. So it's a photo just after the Lincoln Memorial was finished, which was completed in 1922. And the photo shows the surrounding terrain, which had not yet been addressed in any way. And so in the photo, we see the memorial just sitting in a swampy, overgrown field. It's a very jarring image, actually, to see such a familiar piece of architecture in a wildly unfamiliar surrounding. I mean, looking at the photo, it might as well be a picture of the Lincoln Memorial on the lunar landscape. It's just so out of place. Really, it's a very interesting image. And if you think Uncle Joe is just being picky, this photo will go a long way in justifying his concerns. Anyway, it's not exactly a spoiler to mention that, yes, the Lincoln Memorial was eventually built, despite Uncle Joe Cannon's concerns and his almost unique power to grind congressional action on the memorial to a halt. Nor will it come as a shock that most of the major components of the McMillan Plan were eventually put into place, and the Lincoln Memorial no longer sits in a desolate landscape. And I won't bore you with all the details of Joe Cannon's fall from power and all the political machinations which brought it about, but you should know that Joe Cannon successfully blocked the beginning of construction on the monument for 10 years. He was responsible for defeating bill after bill from 1901 to 1910. So when it was all said and done and the bill was finally passed in 1910, what did the proposed architect, Henry Bacon, as well as his sculptor, Daniel Chester French, come up with when finally given their chance? We'll hear all about it when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey there, podcast listeners. Just a quick reminder that you can find all about the workshops and courses I teach, both in Florence and around the world, in not one but in 2 different websites. At thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can see a list of workshops I've got coming up, but if you would rather come to study with me in Florence at just about any time of the year and learning what you want to learn in the birthplace of the Renaissance, you can check out my own website, jasonarkles.com, for all the info you need. Now, coming up this July, I'm going to be in San Jose, California, teaching a workshop at the School of Visual Philosophy. It's going to be a 7-day evening and weekend course in modeling a figure from life in water-based clay. And I'll be teaching the sight size technique of clay modeling, which is an almost purely visual method of constructing figures in clay. And it's a method that I personally swear by. So to enroll in this figure modeling workshop, you can cruise on over to www.schoolofvisualphilosophy.com, all one word, and find the course listing in the classes that they offer there. It's from July 23rd to the 29th, 2017. And again, the class times are all in the evenings on weekdays, with 2 classes scheduled during the day on the weekend. So you don't have to get the week off of work to attend. Very convenient. And then coming up in September, I'm going to be teaching an intensive anatomy course using écorché figures. Écorché figures, of course, are those little skeletons where you add little muscles in clay one at a time, and it's hands down the best way to really learn anatomy. It's not just memorization, it's immersion, and it's hands-on, and it's totally worth it, folks. Now, this course is happening from September 11th to the 14th in the countryside of Dorset, England, at the Art and Sculpture at the Barn Studios. So to find out all about that, again, visit my workshops page at The Sculptor's Funeral, or you can go directly to sign up at www.artandsculpture.co.uk. That's art and sculpture, all one word, .co.uk. And finally, this is kind of cool, but okay, nothing is official yet, but there is starting to look like a really good chance that I will be coming to Australia and New Zealand in the early months of 2018. I am right in the middle of organizing a tour somewhere between February and April of 2018, and I have several teaching venues lining up, but to make it easy for everyone, The more studios that I can get to host a workshop for me, the less expensive it is to fly me all the way out to Australia and New Zealand. And of course, those savings are passed on to you, the participant. So, if you are a part of the Sculptor's Funeral diaspora living down under, get in touch with me. Drop me a line if you're interested in taking a workshop, or better yet, if you have a studio, maybe you'll consider hosting me. So right now, I'm making contact at Christchurch and Wellington in New Zealand, and Sydney and Perth in Australia. But as I said, nothing is solid yet. I'd love to hear from anyone in, say, Adelaide or Melbourne or Darwin, or really anywhere. The best thing you can do is mention me to your local art studios and schools that you would be interested in taking such a course, or you can contact me directly to see where and how you can sign up for a class local to you. Okay, so now let's talk about the monument itself. First off, even though Henry Bacon had been approached in the 1890s about the monument, that committee was not the same committee that was finally allowed by Congress to proceed 20 years later. And that meant that Henry Bacon still had to be officially chosen as the architect. And of course, he had competition. His main opponent was the architect John Russell Pope, and Pope's ideas for the monument to Lincoln were certainly interesting, but really just way too over the top for most people's tastes, probably now as well as then. Because his main idea, this is kind of crazy, his main idea was to build a monument to kind of go with the Washington Monument. And the Washington Monument, of course, is an obelisk, similar to what one finds in Egypt, used to honor the memory of kings and pharaohs. Accordingly, John Pope's monument to Lincoln would also be of an Egyptian flavor, taking the form of a huge pyramid. Can you imagine an Egyptian pyramid at the end of the National Mall's reflecting pool? There's a picture of John Russell Pope's design at the Image Gallery. You should take a look at it. It definitely would make the National Mall a different place. So, John Russell Pope's ideas weren't very well received, as it just didn't look American enough, right? In fact, it looks really way too Egyptian. So his second idea was then to change the design to the form of a ziggurat, or a stepped pyramid, like one finds in Mayan architecture. So, yeah, technically it's more American, as the Mayans existed on the American continents. It still was not what anyone really wanted. So what did the American people really want? Well, interestingly, there was a sizable movement to make a fitting, appropriate monument to Lincoln that wouldn't be grandiose at all, but rather one more befitting the Illinois frontier lawyer sort of reputation of Lincoln. And this movement was actually calling to make the Lincoln Memorial in the form of a log cabin, which, again, an interesting idea, but probably not really one suited to the task at hand. And it seems as though Henry Bacon benefited from these two rather extreme ideas, the pyramid and the log cabin. Bacon's eventual design is monumental without being ostentatious, it's grand without being grandiose, and the contemplative, almost somber character of the architecture seems to strike the perfect note to honor the martyred president. The design itself is Greek Revival, fitting in well with the White House and the Capitol building, taking its forms from Greek temples more than from any other source. The architecture is a simple plan composed of a single enclosed space, which itself is divided into three sort of chambers by 2 rows of columns. Now, outside this single enclosed space, 36 enormous columns encircle the temple, forming what's called a peristyle. It's similar in function to a porch. Now, through the columns of the peristyle, as we stand outside the monument, we perceive the cavernous opening into the temple, which is partially filled, actually, by 2 more columns. And between these columns, we can glimpse, inside sort of the inner sanctum, the statue of Abraham Lincoln. This was Bacon's plan, and this is what we find at the monument today. Now, when the Lincoln Memorial Commission finally approved Henry Bacon as architect in June of 1913, his choice of sculptor to create the Lincoln was, of course, Daniel Chester French. Due to their happy working relationship on numerous other works, French was an obvious first choice. But even so, the sculptor for this commission, for the statue, needed to be approved by the committee. And, in fact, Daniel Chester French almost lost out to Augustus St. Gaudens, which is kind of crazy considering that Augustus St. Gaudens had been dead for 10 years. St. Gaudens, in his lifetime, had sculpted what many people had come to see as the definitive, iconic statue of Abraham Lincoln in a work called Abraham Lincoln the Man, but popularly known as the Standing Lincoln. Now, soon after work had begun on the memorial's foundation, several people in government expressed an interest in seeing a replica of the Standing Lincoln placed inside the memorial. Even though Dan French was Bacon's choice, the sculptor, as I mentioned, still had to be approved by the Lincoln Memorial Committee. Now, interested parties had even approached St. Gaudens' widow, who very much wished to see her late husband's work honored in this way, and she was convinced to go and talk to Henry Bacon himself about the possibility. Bacon records the meeting in this way, and I'm quoting some writing from him. Mrs. St. Gaudens called to see me, and at once opened on me about using the replica of the Standing Lincoln. I stated it would be an outrage to modify this important work of St. Gaudens, and I believe if he knew of it, he would turn in his grave. Mrs. St. Gaudens stated that various people in Washington had expressed the view that the Chicago Lincoln should be used in the memorial, and she asked what she should do about it. I intimated that I had no control over her actions, but that I should certainly oppose any such movement. As she left, she asked if I was going to waive any responsibility in regard to the selection of the statue, and I replied, certainly not. So finally, in December 1914, Daniel Chester French was approved as the sculptor of record, and he got right to work on his design for Lincoln. His basic design came pretty quickly, likely because he had given the subject a lot of previous thought, both when he created his Nebraska Lincoln, as well as during the several years he knew he was at least in the running for the National Commission. French's Lincoln is seated in an enormous chair or throne, both arms resting on the substantial armrests of the chair. The chair itself is not modeled on realistic furniture, but rather serves an allegorical purpose in the way St. Gaudens' chair of state did for his Standing Lincoln. In fact, French's chair is barely a chair at all. It's really a collection of almost completely unadorned geometric shapes assembled into the shape of a chair. The only decorative motif is a fascia running down the front of the chair's arms, reminiscent of the fascia or bundle of rods we see in Jean-Antoine Houdon's statue of George Washington, a connection that is surely intentional. A subtle but important element of this frontal, symmetrical composition is in the form of a flag, which has been draped over the back of the chair and hangs off of the chair's back and sides, visually breaking the straight lines of the shape of the chair. Lincoln himself is seated in an almost casual, relaxed position, which is in contrast to his somber expression and his clenched left fist. The only sense of movement we get in the work is found in the figure's right index finger and thumb, which rise slightly from the armrest. This slight asymmetry between the hands is echoed in the placement of the feet and lower legs, with one foot slightly forward from the other. Now, probably the single largest source of inspiration for the Lincoln Memorial, both for the sculpture and the entire design of the Greek Revival Temple itself, comes from, of course, classical antiquity, but specifically from the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, Greece. Henry Bacon's design closely follows the common opinion of what the now demolished Temple of Zeus may have looked like, down to its low pediment and peristyle of columns encircling an inner sanctum or atrium. And famously, inside the Temple of Zeus stood one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the seated statue of Zeus, which had been created by the greatest of the classical sculptors, Phidias. And it's really interesting because, taking their cues from the 7 wonders of the ancient world, architect Henry Bacon and sculptor Daniel Chester French are continuing a tradition in American sculpture, initiated by architect Richard Morris Hunt and sculptor Auguste Bartholdi, in both the statue and the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty herself pays homage to the Colossus of Rhodes, and the pedestal upon which she stands takes its design from the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Both of these, of course, are 2 more of the 7 wonders. Now, as straightforward as Dan French's sculpture of Lincoln is, there were several twists and turns from its inception as a 3-foot clay model through to its finished form. So initially, French and Bacon thought that the statue should be 10 or 12 feet high, the sculpture itself being only about 7 feet high, sitting on top of a pedestal which would raise it to 10 or 12 feet. Also, the question was open as to whether the figure should be marble or bronze. After the initial model was made, Daniel Chester French then had the model enlarged to its full scale of 7 feet in his Chesterwood studio, and that work was done by an assistant. And here's an interesting little historical tidbit. When Dan French's assistant enlarged this model to its 7-foot scale, he didn't enlarge it into clay, but he actually used plasticine, or oil-based clay. Now, this is actually the earliest reference I can find of a sculptor using oil-based clay for his models. The assistant to Dan French who did the modeling, named Alexander Macchetti, mentioned plasticine by name in a later record. Now, today we call most oil-based clays plasticine, or plastiline, or plastilina, but these are all, in fact, brand names. And plasticine, the brand, one of the first commercially available oil clays on the market, debuted in England only in 1900. And here we have Daniel Chester French in America using it in 1916. I plan someday to do an episode on the history of oil-based clays, but I haven't really done much research into it, so I might find that it was in common use by 1916 in the United States, but I thought I would mention it here because, at the very least, this must be one of the most notable early uses of this material. Anyway, in late 1916, the full-size model had been cast into plaster, and the atrium of the monument where the statue was intended to sit was now complete, and so French and Bacon decided to put the plaster cast in situ to see how it looked. And they immediately came to 2 conclusions. 1, that the statue must be in marble, and 2, it must be bigger than 7 feet tall. Bigger because the scale of the rest of the monument just made the statue of Lincoln, as it was, seem puny. Now, despite the large opening directly in front of the statue, and despite skylights in the roof of the atrium, made not out of glass but out of thinly sliced translucent marble, it was easy to imagine how the subtle modeling of a figure cast in dark bronze might be lost in the gloom. Now, there were a few financial hurdles to overcome with this new plan, as a 19-foot statue in marble almost tripled the price tag. But these hurdles were seen to in due time, and work on the marble version finally commenced in late November 1918. In the meantime, Dan French enlarged just the head of Abraham Lincoln to its final dimensions in clay and then cast it in plaster, so that the marble carvers could then carve the head from a full-size model. But the rest of the figure could be enlarged from the smaller plaster model already made. But before Daniel Chester French gave the full-scale plaster head to the stone carvers, he took it down to Washington, D.C., in order to see it in place and examine the effects of light falling onto the head and face. It's clear that how the statue would be seen in place had become a major concern for French, and he altered the modeling of the large head accordingly. But little did he know, issues with lighting his statue of Lincoln were just beginning. So, who carved this 19-foot colossus for Daniel Chester French? As we have seen in past episodes, large monuments in marble were usually sent to Italy to be carved by the artigiani, or craftsmen, of Carrara and Pietrasanta. However, in recent years, American sculptors had another option, the Piccirilli brothers. 28 years before carving began on the statue of Lincoln, Giuseppe Piccirilli, a stone carver from Massa, which is a small stone carving town nestled between Carrara and Pietrasanta, emigrated to New York, bringing his 6 sons, aged 14 to 24, with him. All of Giuseppe's sons, even the youngest, had worked as marble carvers in Italy, and all went to work for their father in his new carving business that he set up in the Bronx. The family business soon became the go-to carving company for New York's sculpture community. Just about every notable monument and statue carved in marble or stone and adorning the streets and parks of New York were carved by the Piccirillis. Their first significant project was in conjunction with the architect Stanford White of McKim, Mead & White for the Washington Square Arch in 1895. From then on until the 1940s, when the firm closed, the Piccirilli brothers completed literally thousands of works. No one knows for sure how many they did. A very short list of sculptors they produced work for includes Frederick MacMonnies, Herman McNeil, John Quincy Adams Ward, Sterling Calder, Massey Ryan, Carl Bitter, Augustus St. Gaudens, Olin Warner, Laredo Taft, and Daniel Chester French. Along with the colossal Lincoln, which is probably their most famous production, they carved the famous lions outside of the New York Public Library, all the pedamental sculptures for the U.S. Capitol, the New York Stock Exchange, the U.S. Customs House, and the Brooklyn Museum. They carved the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. For Daniel Chester French alone, they produced his early allegorical work for public buildings, his 4 continents statues for the Customs House, the Millmore Memorial, known as Death and the Sculptor, and the Melvin Memorial, also known as the Morning Victory. And all of these sculptures, of course, I've covered already in the first episode about Daniel Chester French. Now, I'm really glad I got to mention the Piccirilli brothers. I've been looking for a chance to, because they're a unique chapter in American art history. I've tossed around the idea of doing an entirely separate podcast just on them, but sadly, much of the details of their history were lost when the firm went out of business in 1945, which was the year that 3 of the 6 brothers died. And their business records weren't preserved. And today, it's maddening to see how little we can actually piece together about the Piccirilli brothers apart from second-hand accounts. There's no complete list of sculptors they worked for or the sculptures they produced. The vast majority of the works they did for others don't bear their family name, but rather, of course, they bear the sculptor's name. One of the brothers, Attilio Piccirilli, was a successful artist in his own right and is the author of a few New York monuments, and he also founded an art school that existed from 1923 to 1940. It was called the Leonardo da Vinci School, and it actually produced several prominent sculptors, including Osamu Noguchi. But much of the info about the school was lost with everything else. It's really only in the last few decades that art historians have taken a closer look at the Piccirilli brothers' contribution to American art in this period. But one thing has always been immediately clear. Without American sculptors' easy access to these tremendously skilled artisans, many prominent American works, such as the incredibly subtle low reliefs in marble by Augustus St. Gaudens, or the colossal majesty of the Lincoln Memorial, they would exist in a different and probably lesser form. In their Bronx studio on 142nd Street, the Piccirilli brothers assembled 28 blocks of Georgia white marble weighing a total of 150 tons into the colossal Lincoln. They began on November of 1918, and incredibly, at least to me, they were done with their work 12 months later. The statue was disassembled and shipped to Washington, D.C., where it was reassembled on site in early 1920. But the monument as a whole was still unfinished. Now, not only the architecture of the monument, but also the landscaping, which includes the famous reflecting pool, which lies directly out the front door of the monument, stretching all the way to the obelisk of the Washington Monument, at which the Lincoln statue gazes. But by the time the statue was in place in 1920, the reflecting pool was finally complete and had been recently filled with water. The large reflective surface of the water had a tremendous effect on the lighting situation of the Lincoln statue, and not in a good way. The reflecting pool reflects light up into the face of Lincoln with an effect not dissimilar to sticking a flashlight under your chin, ruining all the effects that Dan French fought so hard to achieve. There's an interesting photograph that Dan French actually took himself, or rather a pair of photos, and he used these photos to press his case for the Monument Committee's need to address the lighting of the monument. One photo shows the head of Lincoln as French thought it should be lit, and the other shows the lighting of the face of Lincoln in situ, with reflected light coming off the pool. Of course, I have both of these photos over at the image gallery for this episode at thesculptorsfuneral.com. So the solution to this problem, finally, was to remove more ceiling panels to allow more light in from above, but eventually electric lights were also added to counteract the effect of the reflecting pool, and these lights are actually lit 24 hours a day. The lights were installed by the date of the official inauguration of the memorial, which was May 30th, 1922. and in attendance at the inauguration was the last surviving son of Abraham Lincoln. I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast the idea of greatness. There are good sculptors and good sculpture, but then there are great sculptors and great sculpture. And I posited the suggestion that what makes a good sculpture great is significance. Now, others may disagree with that definition, and that's fine. But humor me here as I make the argument for the greatness of the Lincoln Memorial, a greatness which comes not from the sculpture itself, but from how the United States has come to view it and use it and experience it. First, let me start by pointing out that, on its own merits, maybe the statue of Lincoln is not all that great. I mean, it's certainly a good statue, if a bit unoriginal. I mean, there's nothing novel in the pose or particularly excellent in the modeling. I've never heard the word genius connected to the figure of Lincoln. Certainly not the way I hear it connected to, say, the standing Lincoln of Augustus St. Gaudens. Now, it's true, it is a feat of engineering to create a statue this large, but there were larger ones done earlier, and under much more trying circumstances, and without the technology available to French and the Piccirilli brothers in the 20th century. Size, of course, does matter when talking about and thinking about sculpture, and placement of statuary is also something to consider. And the scale and placement of the Lincoln Memorial does project quite clearly that this is a supremely important sculpture. But importance is not the same as significance. The significance of great sculpture is not something that the sculptor puts into his work, but what the culture in which the work exists brings to it. And this was palpable, even at the inauguration of the monument in 1922, when President Harding, during his speech, said, "This memorial is less for Abraham Lincoln than for those of us today and those who follow after." Now, there's one detail of the Lincoln Memorial I haven't yet mentioned, and that is the inscription, etched into the wall behind and above Lincoln's head, which reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." These words, of course, were very deliberately chosen, and chosen wisely. The inscription uses the words temple and enshrine, when perhaps more secular words might well have been used. The inscription mentions saving the Union. The Union is not just a political idea, the union of several states in a political treaty, but it's one of the core concepts of the idea of America, that the people themselves are in unity with each other. At least, that's the ideal. And like most ideals, it lies far beyond the reality we know. But in the Lincoln Memorial, the United States have founded a shrine to the ideal of unity, and have used this secular shrine as its stage, its platform, and its battleground to fight against powers that threaten to weaken American unity. The Lincoln Monument's career as a national, sacred space dedicated to the struggle for American unity really began in 1939. It all started when the nationally acclaimed contralto, Marian Anderson, attempted to book a concert at Constitution Hall. Constitution Hall is one of the most prominent concert venues in Washington, D.C., a hall built and owned by the service organization, the Daughters of the American Revolution. The DAR, as it's known, had a whites-only policy in regards to booking the hall, and Marian Anderson was black. Despite her popularity and broad appeal, there wasn't a single venue in Washington, D.C. that would allow her to perform to what almost surely would have been a sold-out crowd of mostly white music lovers. Word of her despicable treatment spread throughout Washington, and the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, resigned her membership in the DAR in protest, and helped to organize a free and public concert open to all at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. By the date of the concert, Easter Sunday, 1939, it had become a national story. Marian Anderson, an African-American woman standing alone at the foot of the colossal statue of Abraham Lincoln, sang to an audience of 75,000 people who had gathered there, of all races, and to a national radio audience numbering in the millions. The event has been recognized as a milestone in the civil rights movement. And of course, Marian Anderson's concert isn't even the most prominent event to have been staged at the foot of the statue of the great emancipator. The crowning moment of the civil rights movement, the speech by Martin Luther King Jr., commonly referred to as the I Have a Dream speech, took place there in 1963. Beyond the civil rights movement, it's been the scene of protests against the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and really just about every military action the United States has committed, which has been a lot. And there's been marches for the rights of immigrants, minorities. Every disenfranchised group you could name have made their voices heard in the shadow of Lincoln. And it's not just that Lincoln is an iconic figure in the struggle for freedom and equality. The monument itself is in the perfect location as a stage for voices to be heard. Issues which generate controversy and protest on a national level inevitably take their case to the national stage and mount a protest on the National Mall. It's a place that can hold hundreds of thousands of people. It is the logical terminus for a protest march, and with the context of the struggle and sacrifice of the Civil War as a backdrop, personified by the effigy of its most famous martyr, there is no place in the United States, maybe no place on earth, so perfectly calibrated as a forum for the expression of public will. And this is integral to the idea of this statue's greatness. I place this statue in a very elite category of sculpture. I can think of maybe 10 statues whose true value far supersedes the physical elements of its nature and can justly be called iconic. And in the United States, there are 3 such works. In addition to Lincoln, the Statue of Liberty is one, and the Mount Rushmore National Memorial is the other. And Mount Rushmore is also the subject of our next Art History podcast. I want to thank you all for listening. Now don't forget you can check out additional content at the Sculptor's Funeral YouTube channel or on our Facebook group page. And while you're there at the Facebook group page, you can join in the conversation with almost 1,000 other listeners. You can ask me a question or provide an answer to a question of a fellow sculptor. You can show off your work there or just bask in the fellowship of like-minded people. You can also subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile or on iTunes, or subscribe from any service from which you get your podcasts. And you can have the podcast automatically downloaded onto your PC, tablet, or mobile device as soon as new episodes air. And if you want to help the podcast reach other people just like you can leave a review or give the podcast a rating at iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you subscribe. Check out the sculptorsfuneral.com website where you can stream the complete archives of the show. You can check out the image galleries for this and each episode. And you can also find opportunities to support the podcast there as well. And you can do so by purchasing some Sculptor's Funeral merchandise, or if you happen to need to stock your studio, you can click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies, at thesculptorsfuneral.com. Clicking on the link and buying from Blick helps to support the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.